The great air battle, which has been in progress over this island for the last few weeks, has recently attained a high intensity. It is too soon to attempt to assign limits either to its scale or to its duration. We must certainly expect that greater efforts will be made by the enemy than any he has put forth. Hostile airfields are still being developed in France and the Low Countries, and the movement of squadrons and material for attacking us is still proceeding. It is quite plain, sir, that Herr Hitler could not admit defeat in his air attack on Great Britain without sustaining most serious injury. If, after all his boastings and blood-curdling threats and lurid accounts trumpeted round the world of the damage he has inflicted, of the vast numbers of our air force he has shot down, so he says, with so little loss to himself, if after tales of the panic-stricken British crushed in their holes, cursing the plutocratic parliament which has led them to such a plight, if after all this his whole air onslaught were forced, after a while, tamely to peter out, the Führer's reputation for veracity of statement might be seriously impugned. We may be sure, therefore, that he will continue.
Churchill's speech of August the 20th, 1940 was an accurate assessment of the grim prospect facing the British people at that time. Hitler would not abandon the air assault on Great Britain. In fact, it would escalate to even greater levels of ferocity. The Battle of Britain was about to take a new and heartbreaking turn. The full force of the German Luftwaffe would be brought to bear on Britain's cities and onto the British people themselves. This is the story of that momentous time when Britain stood alone, its brave people manning the front lines of battle against the military might of the Nazi conquerors of Europe. This is the story of the People's War, the story of the Blitz. In the Great War of 1914 to 1918, at first Zeppelins and then twin-engine bombers had rained terror down upon the unsuspecting and defenseless inhabitants of Britain's cities. A new war was expected to bring even greater destruction on a far wider scale, and so this time the British people could not afford to be ill-prepared. However, it was not until Hitler had annexed Austria in the spring of 1938 that the appeasing British government shook itself into action. On the 25th of September, as Hitler stood poised to invade Czechoslovakia, the air raid precaution services were mobilized, and the everyday lives of the British people were suddenly transformed.
First of all, we didn't realise that there was a war because it was quite quiet. But then they started putting all the barrage balloons up. It was just like pigs with big ears floating in the sky. Hundreds and hundreds of them.
Nothing very much did happen. We did the bit in the village, in the school hall, gas mask fitting and all that sort of caper, you know, and carried them around for a week or two, and nothing happened, so they got slung in the cupboard, as you would expect.
War started for me, I would say, in 1938, because that's when all the preparations started. I remember the Anderson shelter being delivered to my home in Camberwell, South London, and all the family, of course, had to dig the hole and erect this Anderson shelter.
While we were digging, we found a 14-pound bomb from the last war. So that was a bit frightening. So we had to get the police down, put it in a bucket, and they took it away.
So my father and my brother and I dug this hole, built the shelter, covered it in earth, and the council inspector came along, looked at the shelter and said that's too close to the house. He said if the house was bombed, it would fall on top of it. So we had to dig it all up, take it down the garden and rebuild it.
This is how the housewife is helping the Royal Air Force. Minister of Aircraft Production, Lord Beaverbrook, appealed for aluminium pots and pans, new and old, every description.
Everybody believed that the people of Britain's cities would be the first casualties in the front line of the war. Public shelters were built and trenches crisscrossed all available public spaces. Nearly 1.5 million Anderson shelters, named after the Home Secretary Sir John Anderson, were issued free of charge as early as winter 1938. It was thanks to the enormous effort of the Home Secretary that by the time that the bombs were raining down on the civilian population, over half of it, some 20 million people, could find shelter simultaneously. Many government offices were moved to areas thought to be less vulnerable. The National Gallery moved its treasures to a cave in a disused quarry in North Wales for the duration of the war. The Bank of England descended upon the tiny village of Overton in Hampshire. The severe blackout laws designed to thwart the Nazi bomber crews also had a profound effect on everyday lives. Sometimes enforced to the extreme, these laws made city centres fraught with danger during the hours of darkness. During September 1939, the numbers of people killed in road accidents nearly doubled, and a poll of the public showed that 1 person in 5 could claim to have experienced some kind of injury as a result of the blackout.
They used to come round in their, with their helmets and look to see if there was any light, and they'd knock at your door if there was just a little glimmer of light. It was unbelievable because the streets was absolutely pitch black.
You often hear about some old boy that used to light his pipe and used to spend a long time lighting it. You do understand you can pull an airplane down with that, don't you?
A lady was going to bed one night and saw a cigarette glowing in a garden shed. So she reported it, and the Home Guard patrol went to investigate on the possibility it might be a bailed out German airman sheltering in there. So they crept round there, snatched the door open, covered it with a Sting gun, and there was a harmless old tramp in there, but it could have been a German.
As events escalated on the continent, a great evacuation plan was conceived. Between the end of June and the first week of September 1939, at least 3.5 million people moved from areas, mainly inner cities, thought to be the most vulnerable to Nazi bombing raids. On Friday, the 1st of September 1939, 8-year-old James Roffey found himself being shepherded towards his local train station of Queen's Road, Peckham, in South London.
I remember the day we were evacuated particularly clearly. We went to school as normal, but we realised that things were different because we were all taken out on the playground, and the first thing the teachers did was to come around tying luggage labels on us. Very soon after that, we were led in the long crocodile to the railway station, about a mile, I suppose. You see all these propaganda pictures of the time of parents kissing their children goodbye and all the goodbye cuddles and all that. In actual fact, none of that happened because the parents weren't allowed to be anywhere near us. They weren't allowed to walk with us to the station, and they weren't allowed onto the station platform. And there were police there to make sure they didn't. But then we got on the train, the scruffiest, dirtiest train I've ever seen in my life. We were only going to West Sussex, and that journey, nowadays it would take about an hour, but I think it took anything up to 3 hours that day. So there we were, all these hundreds of children, all crammed into these little compartments, scorching hot, no toilets. And that started all the myths about the evacuees, because some of them arrived in not exactly looking their best.
Despite the best of intentions, under half of London's schoolchildren were actually evacuated, and of those, nearly 4 in every 10 had returned home by the new year. When the Blitz came to London, there were over 520,000 children of school age in the metropolitan area. War was finally declared on the 3rd of September 1939, and Londoners were immediately sent scurrying into their shelters for the first time. A false alarm had been sounded as a lone French plane lost its way across the capital. John Smythe lived with his parents above their pub on London's Isle of Dogs and was just 13 years old when the city caught its first sight of the planes of Hitler's Luftwaffe.
Beautiful day, beautiful sunny day, Saturday, I think. And some mates and I were in the Thames, splashing about, swimming up and down. Because you had to be a swimmer if you lived near the Thames, because you tended to fall in quite a lot, you know. And one day, I don't know, someone noticed all these airplanes up in the sky, and we watched them for a bit, and one of the lads said, there's guns firing there, they're shooting at something, and the barrage balloon went down in flames. That lent us a little bit of speed to our feet, you know, we shot up the steps like rabbits, and for shelter in the pub.
I remember the first morning the German aircraft came over. My father peeked through the Venetian blinds and he said, if that lot of German, heaven help us. He'd hardly said it and the guns on Chittney Marsh opened fire. We used to have a spotter at the school who had a steel helmet, which was quite a privilege. And he'd report if there was gunfire in the area. Otherwise, if you took cover every time the siren went, you'd never do anything. And a lot of factories had roof spotters, and they called them Jim Crows.
I didn't mind when there was an air raid on, because when my boyfriend come home, we didn't go in the shelter. There wasn't room for him, you see. So we used to put a mattress on the table and get under the table. And, well, you know, that was all right. I didn't mind that, see.
We had a dog, and that dog used to be in the shelter before anybody else, even before the sirens went sometimes. They had a sort of sixth sense. In fact, in the end, we had to have him put down because he got too excited.
While the people of Britain's cities began to adapt to their new way of life, Hitler's armies were marching ominously across the lowland countries of Europe towards France. By April 1940, Hitler's panzer divisions were moving through France at a rate of 40 miles in a single day. The push into the Ardennes had taken the Allied forces completely by surprise. Continually outmaneuvered, the French army and the troops of the British Expeditionary Force seemed incapable of building upon any successful offensive of their own. On the 15th of May, the German forces reached their target of the River Meuse. Now, the inevitable process of retreat that would conclude with the evacuation of Dunkirk was underway. Hitler now stood within sight of the stubborn little island of Great Britain. His invasion fleets began to form in the channel ports of France, and Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan for the conquest of Britain, was drawn up. Sea Lion depended upon the total destruction of the Royal Air Force. Without mastery of the skies over southern England, Hitler's invasion fleets would be able to do nothing. As a result, for 2 months, the RAF were goaded almost daily into costly battles with the Luftwaffe. This, the first phase of the Battle of Britain, beginning in July and lasting until early August, saw the Luftwaffe launch a series of attacks on channel ports and convoys. In those first 6 weeks of the Battle of Britain, the badly outnumbered British fighters suffered heavy losses. It took only 5 minutes for German raiders to cross the Channel, while 15 minutes were needed for the Spitfires and Hurricanes of RAF Fighter Command to climb high enough to meet them. During this phase alone, 124 RAF fighters were lost.
We were only a few miles from one of the famous RAF fighter stations, RAF Tangmere. There were no air raid sirens in our village. It wasn't much point because once the Germans had got control of the French airfields, the Messerschmitts could be take off and they could be over Sussex within a few minutes. And so they would come over and they would do what we called hedge hopping, machine gunning. They would come zooming down. They'd machine gun literally anything at all. Land Army girls working in the fields, buses, cars, trains, and this is not a bid for glory, but even children on their way to school. You'd look up and there'd be this low-flying Messerschmitt, so low you could see the pilot very often, and they'd start machine gunning, the bullets thudding into the grass alongside you. Then, of course, there was the great excitement when you would suddenly spot high up in the sky the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. You could always tell if it was a German plane that had been badly damaged because, you know, the smoke and the glycol would start streaming from them, and they would immediately head for the coast. But of course, they had to get sufficient altitude to get over the South Downs, and some of them never made that, and you'd see them smash into the side of the South Downs, great big cloud of smoke and chalk dust and so on, with all us jumping up and down and cheering and everything.
The second phase of the German offensive began on August the 12th. It was an attempt to create gaps in the British defences by destroying key radar stations and airfields. It was to push Fighter Command to the limit of its endurance. On Eagle Day, August the 13th, 1,400 German aircraft were launched in an all-out offensive. It was the largest air attack yet seen in the Battle of Britain. 12 RAF airfields and control centres were bombed and strafed. Over the next 3 days of raids, unprecedented in air warfare, the number of attacking German aircraft increased to 1,800. 2 aircraft factories were hit, yet more airfields were badly damaged, and in one air raid alone, 46 British aircraft were destroyed in their hangars at Bryce Norton. Meanwhile, a decision had been reached by the British government that would further affect the lives of the British people for years to come. On May the 14th, 1940, Anthony Eden announced over the radio the formation of a local defence force. Since the war began, he declared, the government has received countless inquiries from all over the kingdom, from men of all ages who are for one reason or another not at present in military service and wish to do something for the defence of the country. Now is your opportunity. We want large numbers of such men between the ages of 15 and 65 to come forward and offer their services in order to make assurance doubly sure. The name of the new force which is to be raised will be the local Defence Volunteers. Before the end of June, the LDV had nearly 1.5 million members, and at the end of July, its name was changed to the more familiar Home Guard.
I went to the police station, gave them my name and address, told them I was 17, and joined the 12th Battalion, which was based at Dock Road in the drill hall. Then we started training, rifle drill, firing.
We used to do a couple of evenings a week, and of course Sundays we used to go to either the ranges or there'd be some sort of an exercise.
And they gave you a Mills bomb. You pulled the pin out, and it's very frightening when you feel the bomb jumping in your hand. You've got 1.5 pounds of explosive in your hand. So you throw the bomb, and I threw mine, duck your head, and the next thing I know, I had a ping as a piece of shrapnel hit my tin helmet.
They had a cyclo patrol, and I didn't have a bike, and so they put me in a big basket, like a delivery errand boy's bike, and I was sitting in front of this basket with a sting gun, you know. Seems ludicrous now, and rather vulnerable if we'd been ambushed by enemy airborne forces or something.
We did a battle course in the chalk pits at Waldham. It's quite terrifying when they're firing a machine gun at you on fixed lines, and you're watching bullets spurt up in front of your nose. We run through this chalk pit with explosions all around, you know. Machine guns firing, and then the funny thing about it was we got to the end of the run, and some of these old boys, they were trying to climb the cliff as well. They didn't have to do that. In fact, it was dangerous because in that particular exercise, one of the regular soldiers had his leg blown off with a grenade.
They couldn't spare blank ammunition, and you know, you must have a few bangs, otherwise it doesn't sound effective. You know, you can't stand up and say, "Bang, I've got you," can you? You've got to point your gun at someone and make a bang. Well, you know the sort of thing that goes in a Christmas cracker, the thing that, you know, you pull it goes crack. You imagine that 3 or 4 times the size. Well, they used to tie bundles of these with string, and you tied it to the muzzle of your rifle, and a long string to the trigger guard. And when you pulled the string, you pulled one of these crackers. Man, hell of a bang. You know, it sounded quite good. But it was a bit comical, charging across the field, pulling the string, bang, bang. And they issued us with a thunder flash, which was a giant firework. It was probably, I don't know, 1.5 inches in diameter, very nearly, 1.25 inches maybe. And about, the body of the thing was 9 inches long with about a finger's length of fuse pipe. And the idea was you struck the end on a matchbox and it fired, and then you got a little while to get rid of it. That was a grenade. And that made a very satisfying bang.
Our unit used to guard the railway bridges in the area, the actual bridges, and they used to put roadblocks under the bridges, and they were bent sections of railway line that fitted in sockets in the road, anti-tank obstacles. And I remember they were lined with wood, the reason being they discovered that railway line is comparatively brittle, and a charging tank could shear them off. But as it was in a wooden socket, there was a certain amount of give in it, and it wouldn't shear it off. That was the explanation given.
If the conquerors of Europe were to land on the beaches of southeast England, it would have taken more than a spirit of defiance to save Britain. The commanders of Britain's armed forces had few illusions about their precarious position. Most of the British Army's equipment had been left behind in the fall of France, and it now had less than 100 tanks. With Winston Churchill's ascendancy to the role of Prime Minister, economic prudence was finally abandoned. Spending on the war effort rose from £33 million a week in April to £55 million in July. A recruitment drive was pursued to increase the number of trained men in the armed forces, and by the 1st of July, they had absorbed over half of British men between the ages of 20 and 25. Strips of coastline 10 miles deep were cleared and designated as defence areas that could not be entered without a permit. The Sussex village of Pulborough, to where James Roffey had been evacuated, lay right in the middle of this restricted area.
Pulborough, like many country villages, it was completely transformed by the war, and there was the constant threat of the invasion. It became a fortified village. There were gun emplacements built, slit trenches, machine gun posts, tank traps, barbed wire. The whole village was surrounded by barbed wire, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Canadian troops there. When the troops came, that of course did make a big difference to the village. Certainly did to the village social life, because they started holding dances in the old corn exchange every Saturday night.
The period from the 24th of August to the 6th of September was the third phase of the Battle of Britain and the most dangerous time yet for Fighter Command. In the 2 weeks of this critical period, Fighter Command lost 200 more planes than it managed to shoot down. Many of these losses came on the ground, as the Germans launched wave after wave of raids on sector airfields, 6 out of 7 of which were critically damaged. 231 pilots were killed, wounded or missing. Biggin Hill Airfield suffered a devastating low-level attack on the 30th of August, leaving 39 dead and 26 injured. Hitler was close to achieving the air superiority the invasion needed. The RAF was increasingly tempted to throw everything it had against the massive German formations, but it was a temptation that had to be resisted. In a battle of attrition against Europe's largest air force, the RAF would most certainly lose. And it was only the continued resistance of Fighter Command that stood between Britain and invasion. Although the position seemed dire, the balance of the battle was in fact beginning to shift in Fighter Command's favour. On the 30th of August, Fighter Command flew 1,000 sorties in a single day for the first time. This must have come as quite a blow to the German pilots, who were led to believe that Fighter Command was on its knees. Frustrated, Hitler decided that the RAF fighter force had to be brought into battle more quickly. Winter was fast approaching, and the invasion plan required fair weather. He decided that London was a target Fighter Command daren't leave undefended. Turning his attention from bombing the fighter airfields to the bombing of London was Hitler's biggest mistake. Hitler, in fact, had already decided that London was now a legitimate target. In response to a lone German bomber that had lost its way and dropped its bombs on the city of London, Winston Churchill had ordered reprisal bombings of Berlin. As a result, 81 RAF bombers had descended upon Berlin on the night of the 25th of August, causing more civilian casualties. Hitler was furious, and in such willful circumstances, the scene was set for the Great Blitz of London. On the 7th of September, a dense swarm of German aircraft blackened the London skyline. Nearly 1,000 planes, a third of them bombers, covering an area 2 miles high and 800 miles square, sent Londoners scurrying for their air raid shelters. The bombs fell and London was ablaze.
Because the skies was all lit up every night. You could hear all the crackling. It was like Guy Fawkes night every night, and the searchlight, thousands of searchlights.
The Great Raid on London of the 7th of September 1940 was the beginning of a long nightmare for the British people. In that first raid alone, 430 were killed and over 1,600 badly injured. Vast areas of London's East End were reduced to rubble, thousands left homeless. The massive German air fleets that now swept over London had clear objectives. By day, to draw out and destroy what was left of fighter command. By night, to spread terror and confusion amongst the civilian population. The change in German tactics was a colossal blunder. The RAF had been forced close to breaking point by the constant attacks on airfields and sector stations. But now it had gained a vital reprieve. But the price would be heavy. Tragedy for thousands of civilians. Over the ensuing 18 months, 2.25 million people were made homeless, including 1 in every 6 Londoners. There were official rest centres, but at first the government refused to supply any blankets, claiming it would discourage people from moving on. Quickly, the centres became virtual refugee camps. The brunt of the first few days of bombing was borne by the people of London's East End, but there was nothing like the panic that the government feared. There was a near riot when the government called in soldiers to prevent Liverpool Street Station being used as an air raid shelter, but official fears that civilians would descend into the underground and stay there were unfounded. Sheltering simply became part of daily life. The morale of Londoners did not crack. In fact, it was in better shape than in 1939. The catchphrase was, business as usual.
All of a sudden one day there was a great big crash, and that was about 2 turnings away, and that was one of the first bombs in Streatham, and that took, I think it actually took the top of our roofs off, but not too bad. I mean, we could still live there. Then we had another bomb which fell 5 doors away, because next door but one here was a pub and a grocer's, and then 2 doors away a bomb fell, and there was 5 killed there. And it took all the tops of our roofs off, and I remember my cat was sitting on the windowsill, and when I went there he was just covered in dust. He looked awful, poor thing, just these great big eyes, you know. And we all had to go and sleep in the school for about 3 months then.
We got regular, and they came every night at the same time for the next month, over a month. Sirens would go about 6 in the evening, and the all clear wouldn't sound till about 6 in the morning. There was always someone over all the time, back and forth. And of course, they were dropping whatever they could on the island, because they had very little problem with aiming, I don't think. You just dropped the stuff into the U shape and you must hit docks or ships or something. One night when there was a raid on and they dropped incendiaries again, the house caught fire, and we hadn't got any hoses in the SB point because they'd been taken away to fight the fires in the docks. And there were 6 of us round a big tin tub, and each of us had a stirrup pump. And there was a chain that fed the tin tub with water from the next water point. And there was one of the local men up a ladder holding all the hoses we were pumping, trying to put the house fire up with his half a dozen stirrup pump hoses.
My most vivid memory was when the bomb fell down the road, because it was rather sad. It was a serviceman that come home, and his wife, and this little girl always had the most beautiful ringlet. She was like a Shirley Temple, and they was all in the house when it got bombed and they got killed. So, you know, when you saw them bring them up the road, that's when you realised that war was on your doorstep.
People used to come up to the pub, and some of the old ladies used to come up with their jug for a takeaway, you see. And there was one lady we heard the next day. She'd been up to get a jug of beer, and there had been a raid that night. And when the rescue boys came round to sort people out where houses were bombed, this lady was trapped in her house in the kitchen, not trapped so that it was hurting her, just she couldn't move. And one of the men said, "I've never heard language like it," he said. "You know, I've worked on a dock for 10 years, and she was cursing the blue streak because the plaster had fallen in her beer." Nothing else.
Also on September the 7th, the day of that first great raid on London, the code word Cromwell was issued by Home Forces head offices. The signal meant invasion was imminent. From the Outer Hebrides to the Isle of Wight, members of the Home Guard stood at their invasion posts. In many villages, church bells were rung in the belief that the attack had already begun. In fact, the day Hitler had set was September the 15th.
The orders were that if parachutes or airborne forces were seen landing in the vicinity, the local church bell would be rung. And there was a false alarm on that score. My grandparents one night heard a bell tolling, and they got up and wondered what on earth was going to happen. Well, nothing did happen. And they heard it on another occasion, and they saw next door but one neighbours get on their bike and go off in the Home Guard. And they saw them next day and said, oh, it's a false alarm of some sort. So the headquarters contacted all the vicars of the churches all in the area, and they assured them that no church bell had been rung. And then a rumour got circulating that the Germans were coming over, cutting off their aircraft engines and gliding and ringing a bell to cause havoc and confusion. Anyway, the truth eventually came out. Out in the estuary was a navigation buoy with a bell on it. And when the wind was a certain direction, it would rock this buoy and ring the bell, and the sound carried inland. And so the Trinity House authorities had to muffle this bell and issue a notice to mariners to the effect that it would be muffled for the duration of hostilities.
On the 14th, Hitler, in a directive to his invasion commanders, admitted that the necessary air superiority over the British had not yet been achieved. He reluctantly postponed his final invasion decision for 3 more days. Hermann Goering, meanwhile, insisted that he needed only 5 more days of good weather to destroy what he believed were the last remnants of the British Air Force. The Battle of Britain was about to reach its climax. On the 15th of September, Londoners looked up to their skies and saw nearly 200 Spitfires and Hurricanes engaging the enemy in combat. The recent lull in attacks on RAF airfields during the bombing of London had enormously strengthened Britain's fighter defences, and for the first time they could meet the German air attacks in force. It was the climax of the daylight battles, what would later become known as Battle of Britain Day. The concentration of RAF fighters that they encountered over London that day finally convinced the Germans that fighter command was far from depleted. September the 15th was the last serious attempt by the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF. It was the end of the Battle of Britain. At first, Goering attempted to deny the scale of his losses and claimed a few more days would see the end of the RAF forever. But on September the 17th, Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain indefinitely.
Ich konnt nicht widerstehen, ich brach das Blümelein und schenkte es dem schönsten, herzlichsten Mägdelein. Es war ein Edelweiß, ein kleines Edelweiß, holla idi, hollala, holla idio. Es war ein Edelweiß, ein kleines Edelweiß, holla idi, hollala, holla idio.
But Goering would not abandon his campaign. If the RAF could not be beaten by day, the will of the British people would be broken by night. Every night for 2.5 months, 160 bombers would pound the city of London, dropping over 10,000 tons of high explosives and thousands of incendiaries. The RAF, with only a handful of radar-equipped night fighters, could do almost nothing to stop them. On October the 15th, in one of the heaviest raids of the Blitz, the German bomber fleet over London was 400 strong. Incendiaries caused 1,000 fires. 400 people were killed, 900 injured. As the bombing continued night after night, week after week, the rescue crews, firefighters and bomb disposal teams struggled to cope with destruction on a greater and greater scale. Causing major problems were the thousands of unexploded bombs, or UXBs, covering London and the other cities. Initially, only a handful of troops from the Royal Engineers were assigned to deal with them, but by the end of October 1940, a special organisation was created.
We didn't know anything about time-delayed action bombs. We didn't know anything about stethoscopes. It was all learning by sort of experience. The only equipment we had was a hammer and a chisel, which we used to undo the knocking ring. That was all we had.
The first 3 to 4 months of the Blitz, there was nearly 300 men lost. As Walter was saying, they didn't know what they were dealing with.
They were dropping them much quicker than we could deal with them. So the backlog grew and grew and grew.
They were put into category A, B and C. Category A was if one of these bombs had dropped near an ammunition factory or a school, anything that was vital to the war effort, whether that clock was ticking or not, the squad had to go down and deal with the bomb.
During the night, it appeared that a stick of bombs had been dropped between Brentwood and Shenfield, I understand, on the main Eastern Railway line, which was dodgy because we were expecting invasions and the line had to be kept open at all costs. So that particular day, we worked on it, and we actually, on my end, took out 7 50-kilogram bombs, which was a great field day for us. And the other chap, he took out 3, the other 3, because they were deeper. There was around about 20 or 30 railway men standing by, and as we dug the bombs out and defused them, so that the railway men filled in the holes and made the line ready. So round about by, I think round about by 4 o'clock that afternoon, the whole business was settled.
In the United States, radio and newspaper reports of life in the Blitz evoked widespread sympathy. The failure of the Luftwaffe to destroy the RAF had shown decisively that Britain was still firmly in the fight. Already, military equipment purchased in the US was arriving in ever-increasing quantities. American neutrality was being stretched to its limits. While the German failure to bomb Britain into submission had a powerful impact on American public opinion, it also had tragic consequences. The Luftwaffe broadened its attacks to include industrial cities all over Britain. Cardiff, Bristol, Swansea, Clydeside, Belfast, and the ports of the southeast all fell victim to the Luftwaffe's bomber fleets. But the greatest destruction of all was suffered by the city of Coventry.
Bomb after bomb, incendiary bombs fell. And we fought them with what we could. The equipment we had, one after the other. It took a long time. And then, finally, a group of 3 fell on the roof, and, well, the fire blazed up, and we had no more sand and no more water, and practically no more strength to go on. The fire got a big hold. The fire station came, but, well, there was not sufficient water to deal with it, and the fire got a complete grip of the roof and burnt from roof to roof, and all the pews blazed up, a great inferno inside. But there it is. That night the city burnt, and the mother church of the city burnt with her. Can't help feeling that's a sort of emblem of the eternal truth that when men suffer, God suffers with them. And yet the tower and the spire still stands, soaring to the sky, and I feel that's an emblem of the eternal majesty and love of God. It was the spirit of our forefathers that built that grand building. I believe that that spirit is with us still and will help us to rebuild it one day when we've served and suffered a while, a little longer. Build it again to the glory of Jesus Christ.
For the British people, Christmas in the blackout was a new and depressing experience. Already in December, 3,000 had been killed and 5,000 injured. But the year was not yet done. On the night of the 29th of December, the last and most traumatic raid of 1940 was launched. Intending to destroy the area around Piccadilly Circus, the German bombers in fact mistakenly shed their entire load of incendiaries on the tiny commercial quarter of the city. Almost all the buildings on which thousands of incendiaries rained down were locked for the Christmas holidays. With no one to spot fires before they took hold, the old city was soon ablaze. 1,500 separate fires merged into 2 gigantic infernos. That night had been especially chosen by the Luftwaffe. The tide was exceptionally low in the Thames, and selected water mains had been destroyed by high explosives beforehand. The only water available had to be brought from the very centre of the river by fireboat. From beneath London Bridge, Southwark Bridge, and anywhere that could be reached by a hose, water was drawn by a relay of pumps, but still the fires raged. Before the night was over, the old city of London had been virtually obliterated. The Guildhall, 8 Wren churches, Goth Square, the Temple, the Old Bailey, and all of Paternoster Row were engulfed in a sea of flames. It was the second Great Fire of London. But miraculously, St. Paul's Cathedral, a symbol of the city itself, survived the inferno. The trauma of the Blitz would continue for 5 months more. Over 40,000 people would die, more than half of them in London. 2.5 million would be made homeless. But on December the 29th, the very night that London burned, a new hope was kindled in the hearts of Churchill and the British people. In the United States, President Roosevelt warned the people of America that if the Axis powers of Europe were not defeated, then America too would be living at the point of a gun. Britain was soon to gain its greatest ally and begin to turn the tide of war in Europe. As a result, the brave and unbending people of Britain would receive a well-earned respite.